What's new? Anything new? Yeah, the stomach bug the other day. Like a 24-hour bug, so that's why I couldn't make it. I ate some bad Mexican food, some bad tacos. All right, continuing on. We're in chapter 8, which deals with memory. How do we store memory? Different facets, repositories, etc. All right, so memory is defined as persistence of learning over time through the encoding, storage, and retrieval of information. Encoding simply means how we get memory in from the external environment. And we store it just like we would a computer, and we retrieve it just like we would a computer. So in the 1960s, the team of researchers, Atkinson and Schiff, sort of define memory in the ways that you would a computer, right? And that was particularly because it was the advent of the computer being more mainstream. So a lot of the terminology we use with storing memories sounds exactly like a computer would, right? We can code it as we would a computer, put things in digits, zeros and ones, and we make sense of it. And we determine whether we need that memory or memories to be something that needs to be available soon, which we will call like working memory, short-term memory, or they need to go into a long-term, sort of like a hard drive, right? But memory that goes into long-term has been theorized that is permanent. So if something goes into your long-term memory, essentially you could have it there forever, right? Barring exceptions to some sort of head trauma or disability of some sort. All right, so Dr. Ebbinghaus found that more times he practiced a list of nonsense syllables on a day, one, the less time he required to relearn it. On day 2, speed of relearning is one measure of memory retention. What does all that mean? That means the more you repeat something, say if someone was to give you their phone number, if you didn't have your cell phone available and you just didn't memorize it, you would need to repeat it a few times before it could stick just in short-term memory, right? To be able to retrieve it long enough to write it down on a piece of paper in a few minutes. Right? If not, you would forget it that quickly. So if someone gave you their 7-digit phone number or their full 10-digit phone number with the area code, you would need constant repeating or rehearsing in your mind in order for it to be stored in your short-term memory. Tests of recognition and time spent relearning demonstrate that we remember more than we can recall, which is true. So if someone was to tell us our phone number or their phone number, we would try to work on remembering the number, but we actually remember who's telling us the number, maybe the environment we're in, what they're wearing, you know, the lighting situation, whether it's hot or cold, some extra information, right? Even though we weren't fixating or paying attention to that those particular things. So we got a couple models here, right, from the psychologists, right? One is the information processing model, compares human memory to computer operations. Involves 3 processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And then we got connectionism information processing model, which focuses on multi-track parallel processing, the processing of many aspects of a problem simultaneously, and views memories as products of interconnected neural networks. So all that means that the first one, information processing memory, is more simplified, just more direct, whereas the connectionism, it says, well, memory's a little bit more complicated, right? It travels through all these neural networks, it crosses over with some other facets of moving, and learning, and cognition. A lot of times the memory could get wrapped up in some other hardwire in our brain. Thus, it could be, trying to recall certain memories may be very, very complicated, and we'll add things that maybe weren't there when we recall memory. So we talked about Atkinson and Shiffrin, 1968 model, right? We record to be remembered information as a fleeting sensory memory, the immediate, very brief recording for sensory information. What does all that mean? All right, so encoding is getting the information in. You first get information in through your senses, right? Your sensations, it goes into your organs, right? So your organs have memory, all of your senses have memory, and now it has to be processed to make meaning of that. And we briefly record this sensory information, right? It takes place very quickly. We then process information into short-term memory, activated memory that holds a few items briefly, where we encode it through rehearsal. So we rehearse it in our brains, in our mind, right? What we just learned. If something stood out worthwhile that we're conscious of, we will rehearse that thing in our mind, right? And then the other information that surrounds what we're not fixated on is automatically encoded into our sensory organs. So you may speak out about something that you consciously didn't want to because it was also part of that environment. So sometimes you end up saying things more if someone were to ask you about a story or something that requires memory, you'll end up saying more than what you actually wanted to say because there was more information there, and unconsciously you rehearsed it. And finally, information moves into long-term memory, the relatively permanent and limitless storehouse of the memory system of knowledge, skills, and experiences for later retrieval. So memory can be part of your skill set, right? Whether you practice something, it can be part of practicing mathematics, athletics, anything to do with sports, any kind of procedure that you do automatically. Let's say like riding a bike, right? You rode a bike enough times, you no longer need to remember how to ride a bike. It's very automatic, you just jump on and keep going. So skill sets and experiences. And here's the three-stage processing model from Atkinson-Shiffrin, which is used kind of across the board in psychology, right? So we have external events, things that's happening on the outside, and then it goes first into our sensory memory, right? And then we say that automatic processing goes directly to long-term storage if you've rehearsed it enough time, right? And then attention to important or novel information. So your brain is constantly saying, well, what's important right here, right? Even when you take notes in class, you're like, oh, you know, a lot of this is unimportant. And then I'll say something that intrigues you, and you're like, oh, let me write that down. That sounds important, right? But it doesn't mean you didn't gather the other information, right? Even if you didn't want to. You might recall a lot of the things that I said, but and that will go to long-term memory storage. But the stuff that you may fixate or focus on will be here, going into working or short-term memory. Like, well, this is important because I'm gonna have to come back to this relatively soon. And that's why it's called working memory, right? Because you're gonna need it for some sort of activity. Now, if you wanted to go to long-term storage from here, you have to constantly repeat it and rehearse it. If not, that memory will be gone, right? You don't use it, you lose it. So anything in short-term memory needs to be constantly worked on in order for it to progress to long-term memory storage. With the example of, say, bicycle, you need to ride it quite a few times in order for it to become an automatic thing. Or even say like trying to navigate to Concordia when you first came here, you're like, oh, there's different routes, and you take all these different routes, and then you find one that really works, and you have to take it a few times so it's become automatic, right? Now it's automatically locking. You don't even have to work and think about it. So that working memory stresses the active processing occurring in the second memory stage, which we just saw. It is a newer understanding of short-term memory that adds conscious active processing of incoming auditory and visual spatial information and of information retrieved from long-term memory storage, right? So it says visual, right, is auditory, things we hear or things we actually hear inside of our heads when we repeat this stuff. And there's also spatial. So you can kind of recall how this room is set up. You may call out some particular details once you leave. So you can have spatial information being processed. And this also encompasses, say, just little small details, right? You could recall temperature at a certain point of whatever kind of experience you've had. You could recall what somebody wore, you could recall the different lighting, you could recall the colors, the imagery, whatever happened, and something that stood out to you to be part of long-term memory. Bless you.
Thank you.
So badly updated this model, right, in 2002, and this focused processing is handled by a central executive. You just think of it like, maybe like a CEO, right? That's what it's called. Right? There's one central executive that handles this function of dispersing what's gonna be important for short-term working memory and what's gonna be useful long-term. Then we got dual track memory, right? Effortful versus automatic processing. So anything that's automatic requires absolutely no cognitive effort. You don't have to put any effort into something that becomes automatic, like riding a bike, right? If you rode this many times, it doesn't require any effort to try to do it again. Whereas here we're talking about effortful versus the automatic processing. So explicit memory, or declarative memory they call it, memories of facts and experiences that one can consciously know and declare, right? And then we say anything that's very conscious may require some effort. And declare, and we encode explicit memories through conscious, effortful processing, which means we have to work at that particular memory to draw out all the details, find the meaning of it. Where implicit memory, which is non-declarative memory, retention of learned skills are classically conditioned associations, independent of the conscious recollection, and we encode implicit memories through automatic processing without our awareness. All of that is to say that it's very subconscious, right? We don't have to think about that. Here they put up, what's his name? The reporter, Brian Williams. Anyone ever seen him before? This guy, he's a reporter, big time reporter. Anyway, he's a pretty famous reporter for NBC, Brian Williams, and he had reported over during the second Iraq War, right? And he was over there several times. And later on, when they interviewed him or he would talk about his reporting, he started to draw out things that actually never happened, right? So basically, they called him a liar because he would sort of exacerbate his experiences, right? Like overkill. And so basically, they're bringing him up here because they're saying, well, his memory is a little bit jaded because maybe it's a little bit more complicated than what we're saying about memories, right? He added a lot of things that actually did not happen. Maybe it was on purpose, maybe it was conscious, or maybe it was unconscious. So implicit memories include procedural memory. Remember we said procedure is anything that requires you, like riding a bike, right? Something where you have to actually do something that requires a procedure or step-by-step process to do. Right, for automatic skills and classically conditioned associations among stimuli. Information is automatically processed about space, time, frequency. So why do you think there's 7 numbers in the phone number? Why 7 numbers? Why we couldn't have just more than that or less? Yeah, so it's hypothesized that we could remember just about 7 bits of information, right, for short-term memory. Right? And so that's why we have 7 digits. And clearly if you we add an area code, now you get 10, that makes it even more complicated, right? But yeah, so it's theorized that we can remember about 7 things. We would say roughly maybe between 5 and 9. Right, some people less, some people won't be able to remember that phone number in less than 2 minutes. Other people will be able to remember it for a longer period of time. Some people, that same person who couldn't remember 7 digits could remember 5 digits for a longer period of time. Right? So I would say between like 5 and 9 is about the average that a person can remember units of information. Units of information. But we're pretty good at recalling things, right? Like the frequency of things, the time itself, and the space. Like we said, the environment in this room, we could recall certain things when we leave about it. When it comes to time, we're typically about like 5 to 7 minutes margin of error. So like without looking at the clock, you could typically recall what time it is at any point in time of the day within a 5 to 7 minute range. Right? So without looking, what time is it? Without looking. Somebody. Who else? What time is it? What do you think? Okay, hey, we at 8:30. I know you guys look, so now you ruined it.
I didn't look. I swear.
No, I mean, just in general, I know people look, so now they're like, I can't say. Yeah, okay, so it's 8:25, right? 8:25 or 26. So generally, any point in time, when you wake up in the middle of the night, you can kind of recall what time you think it is, and you look at your phone like, oh crap, it really is 1:30. And when it comes to even space, you could kind of recall orientation, like direction that you're headed, right? So quickly, where's north? Give you 5 seconds. Point north. That's north? Okay. Who else says something else? You say up?
Like that way.
You say that way? Look. Let's see where we're at. So you say that way. And you said, what did you say back there? You said that way? What? You said up? Okay. North is mostly this way, right? And you figure that is Augusta right there. That's Augusta, right? So that's south, right? You're heading back towards Roosevelt that way. Right? You're heading back towards Division here. But maybe true north is more kind of northeast, right? Because the earth is kind of tilted 24 degrees. So I would say northeast is more accurate, so like true. But north is this way. I mean, yeah, north is this way, south is that way. So maybe we're not as good at that. Because we're in this room, so we kind of lost our orientation. If we had windows facing that way, we'd be like, oh, okay, clearly. Alright, so remember, automatic processing happens effortlessly, which is things that went into long-term memory. They're effortless. Don't require any effort to remember them or recall them. So with experience and practice, learning skills such as reading and driving become automatic. Do you have to work to read? No. You do have to work if you stumble across a new word, right? You'll stop and maybe Google it or highlight it and look it up or whatever. But everything else you just flow and read. Requires no effort. And many skills are developed this way. Right here they give the example of driving. You don't think about driving, just do it. Sensory memory feeds our active working memory, recording momentary images of scenes or echoes or sounds. So this happens if something's vivid, right? So if something really stands out to you, it'll feed your active working memory, right? But it has to have some sort of significance or importance. So think of that, you become bored very quickly, and then you're not bored from whatever reason. You looked up something on the internet, something came with interest, right? And then you're back to boredom again, right? You're back from boredom again. You look something else and you do something, right? So the stuff that grabs your attention, you would say, oh, okay, wow, this is going to active working memory, right? It's important at this time. And there's two types of sensory memory, our iconic memory and echoic memory, which we'll come to. But here they're just showing a chocolate chip cookie. You look at it, you automatically think like, oh wow, that looks so good right now, right? That looks great with coffee. You know what it tastes like already, right? But this particular image will give rise to some other form of memories in your mind. Oh man, that would be so good. You know what it tastes like. Now I show something you never ate before, you'd be like, kinda related to something, but I never tasted that thing, so I can't really have a memory about it. All right, and here we're given a representation, an alphabetical representation, sort of like an eye exam, right? So let's do this. Let's try this. Let's, all right, you have 5 seconds to look at the screen and remember these letters. And then I'm gonna have you recall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so what were the letters?
K, B, R, S, U, T, N, G, M. What was that? No.
KZ already said.
KZR, QBT, SGN.
What is it?
KZ, RQBT, SGN, pretty good.
When everybody started saying it, I kind of forgot.
So it goes to show you get pretty good working memory, right? Short-term memory, right? If I asked you to recall that literally in like 2 minutes, you'd be like, I don't remember anything. Maybe I'll have you recall it at the end of class, right? To see how good your memory is. So think about this. You won't remember this at the end of class, right? But when it goes away and I'm gonna ask you, you're not gonna remember unless you wrote it down or something. Right? But here, iconic memory is picture image, right? So you see this as a picture in your mind, right? It's sort of a flashbulb picture, and now you can try to remember the details within the picture, which are the letters itself, right? But you see this as one whole picture in your mind. So picture image memory of visual stimulus lasting no more than a few tenths of a second. And then we got echoic memory, which is sound, right? Sound memory of auditory stimuli can be recalled in 3 to 4 seconds. So here we can see that iconic memory, which is more visual, lasts no more than a few tenths of a second. And here, sound can be recalled within 3 to 4 seconds, right? So this is actually quicker than sound. All right, so we said that short-term memory holds a few items briefly, such as the 7 digits of a phone number while dialing before the information is stored or forgotten, right? So we either forget the information or we store it into long-term memory because it's important to us, right? And here Miller proposed the magical number 7 in 1956. And people can store about 7 bits of information, give or take 2. So we say standard deviation of 2, so between 5 and 9. And here we got Badley again, have confirmed that without distraction, we can recall about 7 digits or about 6 letters or live words. And capacity varies with age and distractions at the time of memory tasks. And so really things like if your attention is focused or not, that would have an impact on your memory. And then also age. When is your memory best? Around what age or age group?
26.
26, okay. Right, your memory is best when you're a child, right? Because things are new. You know, so when everything's sort of new environment, you fixate on those things and you're able to recall. That's why kids are able to, if they're tattletelling or something like that, they're able to espouse kind of every detail of what the other kid did. And it gets worse as we get older, right? Because hence as we get older, we may develop Alzheimer's, dementia, all these things that affect memory. All right, so in our memory we have chunking, which is organization of items into familiar, manageable units, often occurs automatically. What could be some examples, right? How you organize into familiar, manageable units. How you chunk information into groups. Because they're important, you need to memorize it.
Association. Association. Association familiar.
Yeah, like you make things relative to others, right? So you connect the dots in some way, shape, or form. You could do that, say, with classes, like your schedule, you chunk things together. Tasks you gotta do after school. Things like that. And then mnemonics are memory aids, especially techniques that use vivid imagery and organizational devices. What's a good example of a mnemonic? Something you use as a memory aid. Something to aid you with your memory. Or some techniques. Yes? Yeah, say an acronym, right? You shorten things into an acronym so that you're able to recall the whole entire full words, right? Which is like when you go on social media and somebody puts a ridiculously long acronym and you still remember, like, you remember every word that it is, even though it's like 30 letters long. And then hierarchies, organization of letters into a few broad categories that divide and subdivided into narrow concepts and facts. All right, so we got distributed practice, so we got spacing effect here. Encoding is more effective when it is spread over time, such as distributed practices produce better long-term retention than is achieved through mass study or practice. Mass practice produces speedy, short-term learning, feelings of confidence, but leads to quick forgetting. Basically, that's like, hey, I got an important exam coming up. I'm gonna I haven't studied anything at all, I don't remember anything, I take notes, I can look at the slides, but I'm gonna try to remember everything within an hour, because the exam's in an hour, right? And then it's time for the test, and you're like, man, totally forgot everything, or 80% of everything, right? So while you're doing that, you're overly confident that you're like, well, I can remember this information, right? But then other things like anxiety or stress may kick in as you're taking the test, and then your mind is quickly forgetting everything. Because you're probably distracted also by the anxiety itself of taking the test. So testing effect. Enhanced memory after retrieving rather than simply rereading information. Repeated self-testing using the retrieve and testing effect. Questions in this text, for example, does more than assess learning, it improves it. So all of this to say, enhanced learning after retrieving rather than simply rereading information. Working on not just like practicing by repeating the same thing, but constantly trying to retrieve the information over time is better than just the practice of it. But just by repeating the words itself, it may not be as effective when you just constantly going back over a period of time and retrieving that information. Practice may not make perfect, but smart practice, occasional rehearsing with self-testing makes for lasting memories. Which means just coming back to things, make it go into long-term memory, right? If you just spread it out over time and come back to it, you're able to put it in your memory, long-term memory repository. Verbal information is processed at different levels, which affects long-term retention. Shallow processing encodes on a very basic level, right? A word's letters, or a more intermediate level, a word's sound, right? So we say you could either think of the sound of a letter, or maybe the visual representation of the letter itself. And then deep processing encodes semantically based on word meaning. Semantics just means different words for different meanings, right? So if you can understand the actual meaning, things are easily to retrieve. Like if you're just trying to remember a word for the word's sake, that's difficult, right? But if you actually know the meaning of the word, that's easy, right? So it has to be more meaningful. So the deeper, more meaningful the processing, the better our retention. Which is important. It's almost for any class that you should take. You should understand the philosophy of the word, right? Or the philosophy of what you're being learned. Which is like, you understand the principles of anything, you can make sense of anything complex associated with that thing. Which is why you can't just jump to like intermediate or expert level things without understanding just the basic fundamental meaning of those things. New information is processed easily when it is meaningful or related to our experience. Say something associated with laughter, you'd be like, wow, this is really funny. That's gonna be extremely meaningful, easier to recall, right? Because it's based on a happy experience. Or maybe a certain trip you went to, you're like, this is, man, I had such a great time. I remember everything happening because it was just, energy level was up, I was laughing, it was beautiful weather, etc. And Dr. Ebbinghaus estimated that learning meaningful material requires 1/10 of the effort compared with learning nonsense material, right? Which is kind of, you think about it like, when you're young, teachers may give all sort of reports about you, like, oh, you don't pay attention, right? You're doing bad in school, right? You're distracted, blah, 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 right? And so we kind of question all these things as psychologists now, because so many kids are, diagnosed as ADD, misdiagnosed as ADD, ADHD. But really, you're just saying like, hey, this person's bored about this other stuff. and they're interested in this thing, right? So it may just have to do with interest. You say, I'm not interested in that, therefore I don't try to remember any of that, right? So when the exam comes, I fail. Why? I'm not interested, right? So it has to be meaningful. You have to have some sort of interest. But if it's something interesting, you'd be able to recall it with minimal effort. If you ask someone to recall something that's uninteresting to them, it takes a lot of effort, right? Then basically, it's useless to them. It has no meaning. Which is kind of my argument for college. You know, like college, you should take stuff that you only have an interest in, right? If not, you kind of like, well, if I'm gonna forget this information later on, because it's useless to me, it's not meaningful, I kind of waste my time. So we have especially good recall for information we relate to ourselves, right? Things are easy if we can relate it to us, right? Because we're mostly concerned about us first. A tendency referred to as self-reference effect. So if you can associate something with yourself, an experience, something you did, something you're interested in, it makes it a lot more easy to recall. And the amount of information remembered depends both on the time spent in learning it and on your making it meaningful for deep processing. Which means that you do need a significant amount of time for things, even if you are interested in, or to still go into long-term memory, right? You still need to practice things and work at it. All right, so our capacity for storing memory is essentially limitless, right? We say barring any sort of head trauma or something that can impact your brain's function. This is contrary to the belief that we can add more items only if we discard old ones. I guess there used to be an old theory that in order to make room for new memories, you had to discard old ones, but that's not true. Essentially, you have the capacity for a universe worth of memories and information in your brain. So if you think about that, how one would say, oh, we only use 10% of our brain. That's not true. Our brain could be, the amount of information in there could be, limitless, in essence, right? 10% really means like you only use 10% of conscious, sort of working activity, right? Where the rest is unconscious behavior. So you're actually like working with only 10% of conscious cognitive behavior. So despite the brain's vast storage capacity, we do not store information as libraries store their books in single precise locations. Things that are stored all over the place. Like we said, we have muscle memory, right? So things may trigger a memory if we activate a certain muscle, a certain organ. If we were doing some specific activity, it might, those memories might come front to the brain. Instead, brain networks encode, store, and retrieve the information that forms our complex memories. That is, the brain distributes the components of a memory across a network of locations in the brain. So memories are all over the brain, right? Depending on their functions. Some of the brain cells that fired when we experience something fire again when we recall it, which means that particular memory could be located in the same location as it was 20 years ago. You may not have migrated. Like I said with muscle memory, right? You may have to do the same activity for it to be recalled later on. Or think of when you hear a certain song that you haven't heard in a very, very long time, right? The same memory associated in your mind might pop up. Like, wow, I haven't thought about that thing in 10 years. So we have two conscious memory systems, right? First is semantic, which is explicit memory of facts and general knowledge. And then episodic, explicit memory of personal experienced events, right? So we have memory for things that are just general, things we need in regular, everyday life in order to communicate with other people, to get tasks done, to get things completed. And then we have episodes. Things are personal experiences. You know, say if you call your mom or your sister or your brother or somebody, things you talk about and engage in is episodic, right? It's something very personal. And then you'll get back to your normal life using your semantic memory, talking to strangers and people at work and at school, just getting things done. So our hippocampus focuses on a lot of this neural center limbic system, right? Remember we said the limbic system is the emotional center. So you have to, for personal things, you particularly have a emotion tied up to a memory, right? Sadness, happiness, any of those, which registers and temporarily holds elements of explicit memories before moving into other brain regions for long-term storage. So that makes it interesting to say, first you have to have some sort of emotion to a particular event for it to become a personal memory. So we could become angry or triggered by certain words, certain phrases. We could become happy when we hear certain things because those experiences tie into our emotions, which are part of our memory. So when we think about those things, those same emotions will give rise. What time is it? Is it 48? Alright, almost wrapped up. And then memory consolidation, neural storage of long-term memories. And lastly, explicit memory. Right? Explicit memories for facts or episodes are processed in the hippocampus and fed to other brain regions for storage. The cerebellum plays an important role in forming and storing implicit memories created by classical conditioning. When we said classical, dealt with Pavlov's dogs. And then the basal ganglia, deep brain structures involved in motor movement, facilitate formation of our procedural memories. So we got that muscle memory, organ memory up in there in the basal ganglia. And then there's also what you call infantile amnesia. Right? We talked about how babies forget people's faces if they haven't seen them frequently enough. Like, so their short-term memory is very fast. Right? They forget things very quickly. So they need repeated exposure in order to actually remember people. Conscious memory of the first 3 years is blank, which means if I actually, hey, tell me about when you were 1, 2 years old, you'd be like, I got absolutely no idea, I don't remember anything. But tell me about last year and when you went on that trip, you'll tell me everything about it, right? So the first 3 years is typically blank for most of us, and a command of language and a well-developed hippocampus is needed for such memory, and the hippocampus is one of the last brain structures to mature. The hippocampus, you know, it's kind of like your prefrontal cortex, you know, finally matures deep, deep down the line of age. All right, that's about it. And so I'm gonna, I didn't have time to do to review the exam. So what I'll do is I'll leave the exam open. All right, the exam will be on Monday, but I'll send the review material this weekend. So how's that sound? So no class Monday, we'll have the exam, right, it'll be timed, and it'll be from 8 to 8:50. So you're gonna do the exam at home. Sounds good? And then I'll send a review material. Yeah.
It's the same format as.
Same format, 5 questions, and the review stuff will pretty much, you know, be 5 items for you to study that's gonna be in there. All right, you guys have a good day.